you have a podcast, there are possible legal implications to consider. Things like, will the guest change their mind about allowing you to publish what you've published? Will they want it taken down at a later date? Will somebody put a claim on your podcast name? Will there be a dispute with the sponsor over the terms you've struck with them? Make sure you understand these issues and cover yourself. So stick around to the end. You will learn so much today from our guest, Emma Heuston, who's a lawyer who runs the Remote Expert. But of course, remember, all advice is general in nature and you should consult a professional directly for your situation. Welcome to Magnetic Pod. If you are looking to attract your soul clients while doing the work you love, this show is for you. Hi, I'm Olivia D'Souza. I'm a podcast manager and content repurposing specialist. The Magnetic Pod Show is about attracting your soul pod of clients through podcasting. It will also include things that can be applied to other areas of your marketing strategy too. Hit subscribe to join me in calling in the people we are here to help. Let's make a massive impact. I am here and I'm ready to be brave. Cannot miss me, I'll stand on every stage. I'm available for my destiny to reach my people. Hey friend, before we dive into today's episode, remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the tips we share in Magnetic Pod on podcasting, lead generation, and business boosting ideas. And remember, if you have or you're thinking about starting a podcast, head over to my website at livymusicmedia.com/freebies. I have loads and loads of free resources and templates that will help you get started. The link is in my show notes. Now, here's your show. Hello, Emma. Welcome to Magnetic Pod.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Pleasure. I have seen you around. I have been quietly stalking you. No, I've seen you on the socials and you often come up as a recommendation, which is lovely. And so it's great to have you here.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here. I'm thinking of starting a pod next year, so it's good to dive in with it too.
You would have so much to talk about, I'm sure. So I'll just introduce you. So Emma owns the Remote Expert. It's a virtual law firm for online businesses. So she helps clients in two main ways, with legal information. So I've seen that you have these templates, which is brilliant because if people need something and they want a more affordable option, there's amazing templates on your website. But sometimes also people will need a specialised, personalised solution for them. So you also do that as well. So can I ask you how you got into doing what you do now?
So I have been a lawyer for 22 years, but after having my son, he's 10 now, the 9 to 5 just wasn't working for me. And I took a remote role. We left Sydney when my son was quite young. I took a remote role as a partner, but it was still a bit challenging. And I could see lots of other mums and parents struggling with that same push and pull. And I started this, I first of all wrote a book called The Tracksuit Economy about working from home, which led me to start this business around remote work. And when I got all these sort of remote work people, I realised most of them have started their own business because it wasn't necessarily flexible to always work in other businesses. And there's this whole online business community out there. And this was actually before COVID. So I started this business in 2019. And of course, since COVID, it's even more online. So there's this whole online community now. And we really focus on the areas in business. So I'm a commercial lawyer, but we really focus in on people who have podcasts and online courses and e-commerce businesses. So who sometimes work from home, not always, but who do have that online element to their business. And that's actually most businesses now.
It is.
Yeah.
It's certainly it was already happening, but wow, it certainly went on steroids, I guess, the whole transition over to online and working from home. Actually, before we get into all your tips and advice and all the stuff you do, I saw something that was really interesting. So it's up to you if you want to talk about it. But you mentioned on your website about, because I can cut out anything, the near-death experience. Do you want to Do you want to share that?
Yeah. So when I was pregnant, and this is probably also part of the, life's too short, start your own business. When I was pregnant, I had really bad morning sickness. Couldn't keep anything down. I was in the emergency ward and given an anti-nausea drug, and that caused a sudden cardiac arrest. So I spent some time in intensive care. I was 13 weeks pregnant. Fortunately, my son and I both survived. I had to be resuscitated, and we
Oh, my goodness.
survived that. So we have one child by choice after that, because we're not quite sure what caused it. We think it was a reaction to the drug, but we just don't know. So that's sort of too, when I, got back, it's sort of triggered, I think, some things in my body like fibromyalgia, which means that I get really sore muscles if I do too much, because I haven't been, since I had my son, I haven't been, I suppose, the same as I was before. And I put that down to some of that stress of the event. So I have to be really careful about energy and being really purposeful about what I do in business. Working from home allows me to have a business that's really challenging, but also allows me to, structure my day in a way that's better. But it also, I think, is, well, if not now, when? When am I going to do that thing? If I've been waiting or, miserable working for someone else, or it's not really aligned to my values, which is where I got to in the job before I started this business. It just wasn't lighting my fire going to work every day. It was paying the bills. The people were fine, but it just wasn't right for me. And I kind of thought, well, why not? So that's sort of been, I think, now a sort of a life's too short kind of message that I take with me day to day, and not to stress over bigger, the small stuff, I suppose, and just to do it and get things done.
Wow, so there's nothing like being reminded of your mortality, I guess, to really put things into perspective. Okay, so how are you helping people these days?
So we have, as you mentioned in the intro, we have two ways we help people at the Remote Expert. The first one, actually 3 ways. The first one is the online templates, and they're really good for people starting out, people with budget considerations, or if it's kind of a simple kind of arrangement. And certainly templates are no substitute for customised legal advice and documents, but they're certainly better than not having anything, or grabbing some free thing, or copying your friend's thing. And we know they're drafted well. They're drafted by lawyers. So that's a great option. And for some people, that's perfectly, just what they need. For others, if you've got a really complex deal that you're putting together, then you probably do need that. So we help with legal services, and there's myself, my lawyer Leanne as well works with me with that. And then the third thing we do, because we do a lot of digital, we have our templates and digital products, and we do a lot of services around other digital products like digital courses, podcasts, that kind of thing. I do some digital product strategy work, so working out what's right for you. So in a lot of service-based industries, templates work really well, like we have. Other industries, courses work really well. Other things, podcasts work really well. Just working out, well, what's going to be the best fit, and then what do you need to do to protect yourself? If you're putting a course or a podcast up, what sort of legal framework do you need underneath that to protect yourself, rather than going out there then 6 months later having a problem and then calling someone like me going, help, this has happened. You better sort of having that at the start. So having that really clear strategy at the start works really well in terms of, well, I need, when I do this thing, when I get my podcast out, when I get my course out, then I need these documents to go with it, these templates or these documents.
Okay, so let's say that someone's starting a podcast. Someone's listening to this because they wanted to know about podcasts. They've either got a podcast or going to start to do them. What are some of the things they need to be aware of from a legal point of view?
So I think the first thing, and probably apart from putting it all together and thinking about what topic, the first thing people would come to would be the name. How do you name your podcast? And there's a lot of podcasts out there. So making sure you have something unique that doesn't get confused, because you don't want to give your podcast a name that gets, then people search and they find someone else's podcast and listen to that instead.
Mm-hmm.
You also don't want to have a name that someone is using for a podcast that could cause trouble, and it could land you in trouble if you start using that and then you get a cease and desist letter from them. So it's really good to do that research. And if you think it's going to be a really, long-lasting brand, it's worth thinking about having a trademark for that podcast name as well to really protect that brand. And a trademark when it's registered, it lasts for 10 years in Australia. So it's a pretty long-term protection there, provided you keep using it.
Will it protect you worldwide?
No. So you can apply in Australia, and then you have to make an application either through the World Intellectual Property Organisation. You can do something called the Madrid Protocol, which goes in different countries, or you can go to, say you also have a lot of listeners in the US, you can go there and do a trademark there as well. So you would need to work out what your strategy is, but you would probably start, say you're based in Australia or whichever country you're based in, you would start in the country you're based in and then look at that strategy. Well, do I want to go worldwide or to certain other countries? And then you have this sort of a 6-month grace period to do that without a fresh application to extend that and use the Madrid Protocol with them. But I would recommend getting an experienced trademark lawyer for that, because it's quite tricky.
A lot of people start podcasts and they have all these good intentions, but then there's pod fade where they maybe do a season and then that's the end of that. So one of the things, like, I'm aware of, obviously searching the name and coming up with something unique. If even aside from legal factors, if you want, like you said, if someone's searching it, you're the one, you want yours to be found. So sometimes there's podcasts out there that exist that might have the name that you're so in love with, but they haven't made an episode for a couple of years. So what would you recommend then? Would just reaching out?
Yeah, I would reach out and just say, look, I really like this name. Are you using it? I suppose the danger with that is they might be leaving their episodes up there. So you could still have that issue. They might not object to you using it. And if you have their consent, you're less likely to get a cease and desist letter, for example. But you do need to there. And I think, be a good person, reach out, just have that communication rather than doing it, crossing your fingers, hoping they're not going to get in touch. I think just tackle it head on. And if it's not possible, you probably think of something better.
That's right. Okay, what about problems with guests? What kind of things can happen with that?
So I suppose, and you would have had podcast guests in the past and, where they're like, they're just difficult or you don't really gel, and you might want to, for example, not publish an interview because it's just not right. So you want the discretion to be able to choose that. But you also have the flip side where the guest, they might do a podcast, and sometimes there can be a long, it might be a month or two before a podcast gets published, depending how far ahead the schedule is for the podcaster and recordings. And they might want to pull the interview, or they might have said something that they then want to edit out, or expect payment. So, which can happen. If they find out you've got a sponsor, they might kind of come back and want payment or to do something. So what you want to do as the podcaster is have complete control. You talk to this guest, deal with any objections they might have. So you might need to put a disclaimer in that, it's general information, not advice. But you want to be able to then edit that And it could be putting it in a best of show. It could be using part of it rather than all of it. And you want to be able to do that in a way that gives you freedom, complete freedom to do that, rather than having someone come to you and say, no, pull that. I only want those 5 minutes in, and I want you to mention my show, this and that. So I think get clear on what you do need to mention for your guest, and then make sure once you do it, you've got a podcast release form, which sort of lets you do that, lets you have that creative and editorial freedom.
That's right. Well, you do it to create content, so you don't really want to be held back from that. I mean, generally I do say, like, if we cover anything, if I ask a question that's personal, that I will let people know that I can edit it out, but that's within a time frame. If they haven't let me know and I've gone and published it, you want to make sure everything like that is clear.
Absolutely. You don't want to be told after you've published it or the day before. It needs to be just, again, that communication piece is really important there as well.
Now, I'm just having a look at some of the things. You've got a blog, actually, that I should recommend, which is on your website, theremoteexpert.com. And one of the things you're mentioning here is about the litigious listener. So really, listeners can cause a problem? Tell me about that.
They can. And I suppose you think about someone listens, they're, a top fan. And if you look at people that maybe troll comments online, you get a little bit of a sort of an idea about the trouble people can cause. But people might be listening to this thinking, right, I need a guest release, I need a disclaimer. And they were to take action, they just wrote their own or copied one off someone else. And then they got in trouble. They might come back and say, well, you and Emma told me to do this and it didn't work. So I think, it needs to be really clear, because podcast is entertainment, it's general information. Every single person listening to a podcast won't have the same circumstances. And it's really important, particularly when you're talking about really sensitive things. So, I have friends who have family law podcasts, and they have guests on, like psychologists, and they give general advice, general information about things that can happen, but that's not necessarily going to translate to be the same. And same with having a doctor or a psychologist on a podcast, it's going to be general circumstances. And because you're the publisher of the information, you as a podcaster need to protect yourself, to make it clear that it is information. And it's a great idea to have a listener disclaimer on your website where people listen to the interview saying it's the guest views only. And you could have a really controversial guest on who swears or who has a really controversial view that could come across as discriminatory in some way. And you need to then protect yourself to say, look, it's not, the guest views aren't necessarily our views. We're bringing you content. And part of freedom of content is for people to express those views. But you don't want to break any laws doing that or get caught for, sort of get in trouble for defamation because you've published something online, either as a transcript from your podcast or your podcast. So just having that disclaimer, and you might read out at the end or start of your podcast that guest views are their own. It's information. If you need professional advice, you should go and see that professional about your specific circumstances. And it's also a really good idea to have a link where the platforms you list your podcast on, so say Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast, and your website as well. Just that disclaimer that it's general.
And you would say that for your own content too, I'd imagine, that this is general advice.
Absolutely. What we're talking about today is general advice. Someone who has a podcast about pig farming might be very different to, a doctor. But if people follow that advice without as advice, I suppose, rather than information, that could be a problem. So just to, and 95% of people are going to understand that, and they're not going to hold, but it's that 5% that are the danger zone there.
So most of my clients that have podcasts do it because to promote their own business. So as a bit of a lead generation and a branding tool, and as a way to create relationships with people that they get to meet through podcast guesting and all of that. But there are some that also look for sponsors. So what are some of the things that can come up if you have a sponsor for your podcast?
So I think a sponsor is a really great way. If you're able to get a sponsor, that's really great. But I suppose with money, nothing comes for free. So in return for being a sponsor, that sponsor wants exposure. And you've just got to be careful it's just got to be documented, because if you said to me, I'm going to sponsor your podcast, and I said, great, okay, well, give me $500 a month and you can be the gold sponsor, and you gave me the $500 and then I did my podcast and didn't mention you, then you'd be pretty angry. And then you might say, oh, you should mention me. And I say, oh, well, Magnetic Pod has sponsored us. And then that's it. And I say it right at the end when nobody's listening still. So it's got to be really clear what that sponsorship involves. Do you mention them in your social media posts, going new sponsor? And I would go, we'll mention you 3 times per episode. We'll tag you on social media. And then they should also be sharing your podcast to their audience. Part of that is, well, we're proud to sponsor the Magnetic Pod. Here's a link to the podcast this week. This guest is really great. And it gives them content, but it also gives you exposure. And it's important to think about, well, do they expect to come on as a guest every little while, or what do they hope to get out of it? Is it a pre-recorded mention at the front saying, thank you, this podcast is brought to you by the Magnetic Pod, and a little plug? Or is it sometimes and you sort of hear in podcasts different things. So sometimes someone sponsors it, it's at the start, but then often you'll have breaks in podcasts where there are little ads. And some people just put ads about their own testimonials about their own thing, and other people sort of do ads from sponsors. So I think you've got to be really clear about what that involves, what you'll say, what your expectations are around exposure, that it's sort of a mutual sharing on social platforms. It could be that you go in there, or they go in your email list sending out a new episode update. So all those things need to be clear and documented. So if there's a problem, you haven't met that target, and how to end it or what to do about it, rather than just taking money and then not mentioning them, or mentioning them and then the money doesn't come. You need to be really clear about, well, when the money gets paid, and if they don't give you the money, then you're probably going to stop mentioning them. So as a podcaster, so it's very much a two-way relationship. It can be a really fruitful relationship, but you need that structure and the framework to make sure everyone's happy. And that document, it's almost like a safety net to do it. A sponsorship agreement is a really good idea with that.
Yes, I think sometimes people shy away from these legal things, thinking it's it's really not that complicated, and we have a good relationship and all of that. But really, just being clear and knowing what the expectations are just gives you a good basis for that relationship. It sounds to me.
That's right, and it's just really being clear and open, because when I say, oh, you could sponsor my pod, you might think, oh, well, that's just me telling a few people about it or giving you $50. But I might think it means you're giving me $1,000 and you're going to share it on this platform and run a Facebook ad. And, very different expectations, and just
Absolutely.
making sure everyone's on the same page, because that's where a lot of business deals fall down, when people aren't on the same page. And it's about the confidence, just with saying, right, let's just make sure we've got all these things covered, and then we can go ahead and not worry about that. It's sort of like making your will, then not having to think about it again.
I do know, for example, that there is a different kind of price generally when I'm keeping up with what's happening with sponsorships. I know the ones at the beginning or mid-roll are more valuable than mentioning at the end, so that does make a lot of sense.
That's right. And often I've seen people's podcast structure, sponsorship structuring, and they offer, say, platinum, gold, silver, bronze, whatever level you want, and they have certain inclusions. And I think that's a really great way to open that conversation as well as a podcaster. When you're looking for sponsors, just have it really clear what they'll get as a sponsor, depending how much they'll pay.
Okay, I think we've covered most things, but you do have something that you mentioned here in your blog about copycats. Is that, what happens with that? Do you want to just touch on that?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky, because we have a lot of people in all types of business saying, I think this web page or this social post looks like ours, and copyright's a bit tricky. And then if you've got podcast audio, you might repurpose it to your website as a transcript, and that's really great for SEO on your website. And for other people, some people prefer reading rather than listening, or they're hearing impaired. But it does mean that you run the risk then of people coming to your transcripts and copying out big slabs and using it in some other way. So they use a blog without crediting you. You need to make sure on your website that you have terms and conditions to say that, so website terms of use, all the content on your website is yours, and it's not to be used without your permission. So just to protect that kind of thing there, and it's hard, because if you're talking about the same topic, yes, it can come across as similar, but so you've really got to look for that direct copying. And it would be fine if someone then said, well, Emma said this in the podcast and credited my business or me. But if they didn't, if they just copied it on their website and had it in a blog or something, then that would be a problem. So keep an eye out for that. But also make sure you protect yourself with website terms of use about how people can access your content on your website and how they can use it. So they can read it, they can consume it, but they can't just take it and copy it and use it for themselves.
Especially if they don't credit it. If they're going to copy it, at least put a link back to your website.
Exactly.
So that you get
or ask you, look, do you mind if I link this to my blog? And it's that communication, which is a really common thread through all of this. And podcasting is about communicating, so having conversations. So
absolutely. So my goodness, you are a wealth of information. I think we could talk about so many other things, but we are running out of time. So is there anything that we left out that you would like to make sure is covered?
Look, no, I think we got the main sort of the top 5 issues. I think probably the best way is to go to theremoteexpert.com/blog. And even if you search podcast, if you're interested in podcast blogs, there's, I think, 3 different blog posts that deal exclusively with podcasts. So that's probably the way to really deep dive in. As you said, we could be here all day and people would be going a bit cross-eyed. So it's probably good to leave people with things to think about, and then to either reach out or come to our website or our blog and have a look at, to work out what they need.
And even besides podcasts, you help with all aspects of businesses. I reached out to you recently because I also do social media management, and she had a question about using about using photos that she saw in the media of her products and whether she could or not. So whether it's social media, you're a coach, you're a service-based business, any of those things, I'm sure you've got solutions for all of us. So thank you very much for being here. How can people reach you?
The best way would be to go to the website, www.theremotexpert.com, or I'm on Facebook and Instagram at The Remote Expert on both platforms. And then all my email and other contact details are there as well.
Thank you. All right, we'll put all that in the show notes.
I could probably hear my husband now. Got the door shut, but yeah.
I think because I do podcasts and I'm a podcast producer, I feel that much more pressure that everyone expects absolute perfection, but keeping it real, people, these things happen. Other people in the house make noise and sometimes it just gets in there.
Yeah, that's unfortunately it's right at the end.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Emma.
All right, it's been a pleasure.
So, what were your key takeaways from today? Did it raise any questions? What would you like to know more about? Let me know. You can contact me via social media or email or join my free Facebook community, Magnetic Pod. I don't care which way you use, just reach out to me. I'd love to chat with you. And remember, you can get access to lots of free podcast resources that will help you get started or help you improve your podcast at livymusicmedia.com/freebies. Hit subscribe because I want to see you again. But for now, go forth, be the awesome person you are, live the life you want to live, and have fun. You've got this. See you next time.
Unavoidable everywhere you see me, reach my people, claim my power, there's no hierarchy. It is me and the universe, baby, rock solid and so ready to reach my people.
Hello, it's Livy here. Have you ever wondered about what the key elements are that make a podcast truly stand out? Or maybe you're thinking about starting your own special podcast and feel a bit overwhelmed and don't know where to start? Well, I have something for you. Introducing the Ultimate Podcast Checklist. Da, 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 da. It's a step-by-step guide that covers everything from the initial brainstorming to advanced growth strategies. It's the perfect companion for both new and seasoned podcasters. And the best part, it's absolutely free. Da, 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 da. To grab your copy, simply head to the show notes of this episode and you will find a direct link there, and then away you go. Remember, every podcast started with that initial spark and the right resource, so let the Ultimate Podcasting Checklist be yours.